The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars had not been kind to the Spanish Navy, with it rapidly shrinking over the course of the 19th century from one of the top 3 navies on the planet to not even in the top 10. Witnessing most of this decline was Don Juan Bautista Antequera y Bobadilla, who'd joined the Navy in 1838, and now, almost half a century later in 1884, he'd managed to become a rear admiral, retire from the Navy and move into politics, still determined to somehow renew his beloved Navy. With a new government, he was appointed Secretary of the Navy, and he proposed a 10-year program of construction which would aim to build 6 large and 6 small battleships, a pair of armoured cruisers, 32 torpedo boats, 7 first-class protected cruisers, 9 second-class cruisers, 11 third-class cruisers, and dozens of smaller auxiliary warships. However, this plan ran into 2 large problems. Firstly, the Spanish Navy itself hadn't quite decided what it wanted, with a number of officers arguing that a fleet of large, fast armoured cruisers would be better than slower battleships, and secondly, Spain rather lacked the cash for a major naval building project of this kind, since the gold and silver resources in South America that Age of Sail Spain had relied on had since fought for and won their independence. Not to be put off, he actually ended up ordering one of the battleships before the entire proposal actually went to the government for approval. This was to become the sole pre-dreadnought battleship of the Spanish Navy, the Pelayo. Since Spanish shipyards at the time could only build a vessel of up to 6,000 tons, bids were solicited from the UK and France, with the French Société Nouvelle des Forges et Chantiers de la Méditerranée winning the competition. The 2 British yards had offered a modified and enlarged version of the Brazilian ironclad Riachuelo, and a much larger vessel with 4 main guns, respectively, whereas the French company had offered an adapted version of the French battleship Marceau. But critically, they had offered it for 500,000 pesetas less than the cheaper of the 2 British options. That was a deal winner for cash-strapped Spain, although the actual costs would end up being far higher, as is often the case when you go with the lowest bidder. The ship's main battery was to consist of a pair of 320mm or 12.6-inch 37 caliber guns, one fore and one aft on the centre line, and a pair of 280mm or 11-inch guns in wing mounts, one on either side. All these were of the Canet Model 1883 type, and so, although mostly barbette mounted, they did also have a domed shield over much of the barbette to offer some protection to the crew. A dozen 120mm or 4.7-inch guns comprised the secondary battery with 6 guns per side, with a single 160mm or 6.3-inch gun also present, and a wide array of small rapid-firing anti-torpedo boat weapons scattered across the ship. Half a dozen small torpedo tubes would complete her loadout. Being French-built, she was protected by Creusot steel armour, which was up to 17 3/4 inches thick on the belt and up to 2 3/4 inches thick on the deck. Speed was just over 16 knots, thanks to 8,000 indicated horsepower from a vertical double expansion power plant driving 2 screws, with forced draft optional to give a small speed boost for a short period of time. She was laid down in 1885, launched in early 1887, and commissioned in mid-1888. Her first mission, before even having her main guns fitted, was to browbeat Morocco into stop pirating Spanish merchant ships anymore. This succeeded, at least for a while. Various more diplomatic visits were also undertaken, along with exercises with the rest of the fleet, before it was time to intimidate Morocco again. She was due for an overhaul in 1898, which called for more armour to be installed over the secondary battery, which itself was to be replaced with slightly fewer but larger guns, as well as the installation of new boilers, amongst other works. But the outbreak of the Spanish-American War meant that the ship left Toulon with nothing to show for it except for a pair of Nordenfeldt autocannon. Initially, with the majority of the US Navy blockading the overseas Spanish squadrons, the Spanish Admiralty thought of using Pelayo, the ironclad Vitoria, and 3 destroyers as a distraction, which would allow 2 cruiser squadrons to attack the US East Coast and US shipping in the Atlantic, respectively. However, the Spanish spies needed to report on US fleet movements to enable this plan were detected, and so Pelayo, along with the cruiser Carlos V and a number of smaller vessels, were instead earmarked to head for the Philippines and at least try and restore Spanish control there. The issue was that due to the strength of the US squadron that was present, Pelayo was an absolute necessity to have superiority. But her operational range wasn't all that great, and so a whole series of coaling stops and colliers needed to be organised. But this effort was ultimately blocked when the US persuaded the UK to apply strict neutrality conditions to the Suez Canal, which the latter controlled. Turning back and sailing across the Mediterranean, the war ended before sailing around Africa could be sorted out, and the ship was sent back to France for all of the upgrades that she was supposed to have had installed before. With this work done, it was back to exercises and showing the flag visits until autumn 1911, when it was time for yet another visit to Morocco, this time bombarding a number of targets as part of what would become known as the Kurt campaign. These attacks and other support operations went on for the next couple of years, except for a brief period when she was forced to withdraw in late 1912 after she ran aground and needed repairs. 1913 saw a change in fortune. The entry into service of the small dreadnought España meant that Pelayo was no longer the biggest and meanest ship in the Spanish Armada, and so with the newer ships ensuring that Spain's neutrality in World War I was respected, she went back to shooting up bits of Morocco, a mission which continued well into 1916. By 1919 she was judged to be worn out, and so became a training ship, although her machinery was then overhauled the following year in order to keep the ship mobile. She was then decommissioned in the summer of 1923, then apparently brought back again briefly, before being decommissioned again in May 1924, and then being sold for scrap the following year to a Dutch company.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.